poor girl left after 3 years as the CEO's secret lover. Only then did he realize she's his only cure. She stood in the rain outside the Huo family mansion, her pleading calls ignored as security escorted her away. For 3 years, Lei Han had been CEO Huo Jinchan's secret lover, hidden from his prestigious family in the public eye, until today, when he cast her aside like yesterday's newspaper. Fast forward 6 months, and the same woman walks confidently through the doors of Beijing's most exclusive gala, now introduced as the fourth daughter of the powerful Li family. The champagne glass in Huo Jinchang's hand shatters as he recognizes her. Too late, he realizes she wasn't just some dispensable girl. She was the only medicine that could cure his cold, empty heart. Leon's world was built on hope. For 3 years, her heart clung to promises that were never spoken, but always implied. One day, Hua Jinchang would show the world what she meant to him. While he navigated the glittering lights of high society parties and press interviews as the dashing CEO of Huo Corporations, she waited in the shadows. Their relationship was a secret she couldn't share, but one she believed was real. With each passing day, her patience became another sacrifice. There were dinner dates interrupted by his business calls, quiet nights when he couldn't stay, and birthdays spent alone with a single flower sent by his assistant. She told herself these were small prices to pay for love. What kept her going was the idea that she was different, that she wasn't just some fleeting affair in his life. There were stolen moments when she glimpsed his softer side, the way he'd brush a strand of hair from her face, or the warmth in his voice when he whispered, "One day, we'll be free of all this." Those fleeting sparks tied her to the idea of him, yet there was an unspoken condition neither of them dared to acknowledge. She had to stay invisible. For 3 years, Li Han played her part, a hidden figure, in his carefully curated world, and always the question lingered. How long could a love confined to shadows endure? When the truth came out, it wasn't because Huo Jinchang decided to step into the light with her. It was because his family found out first. The Huo family was the kind of dynasty that treated their reputation as their legacy. To them, appearances didn't just matter, they were everything. The discovery of Lei Han's place in their son's life was not just an inconvenience, but a threat. The confrontation was swift and unkind. His mother, Mam Huo, with her impeccably styled hair and steely gaze, sat across from Lei Han, in a private room at an upscale restaurant. Beside her, Hu Jinchang sat in silence. "Miss Lei Han," Madame Hu had said, her voice sharp, "I think you and I both understand the reality here. My son has an obligation to our family, our name, and to someone far more suitable." She slid an envelope across the table. "This is more than fair compensation for your time." Leon's breath caught as her eyes darted to Huo Jinchang, looking for some sign of defiance, a hint that he would stand up for her. But his head remained bowed, his lips pressed in a tight line. The silence spoke louder than any words ever could. It wasn't just his family rejecting her, he was letting them. When she didn't take the envelope, the next move was far more calculated. Lei Han didn't instantly realize what was happening when rumors about her began circulating online. It started with whispers of an affair. Then came the staged cheating video, a grainy clip showing a woman who resembled her in an intimate moment with another man. By the time she pieced together who orchestrated it, the damage was done. She was branded a mistake, a gold digger who had dared to climb higher than her station. Hua Jinchang's press team issued a short statement denying any personal ties. His silence in public, compounded by his family's well-timed disinformation campaign, made her out to be the grasping liar they wanted the world to believe she was. The humiliation was relentless in its cruelty. Strangers online dissected her supposed ambitions with righteous scorn, while anonymous accounts leaked posts claiming she was using her relationship with the CEO for financial gain. Videos about her surfaced, complete with speculative commentary on how someone like her could never truly belong in the world of high society. For every false accusation, there were hundreds of comments calling her vulgar, cheap, and worse. It became clear who held the power in these narratives: the Huo family. With their resources and influence, they controlled not just the perception of events, but the very elements of reality itself. In their world, a smear campaign could erase 3 years of love with the stroke of a pen or the click of a mouse. As research notes show, this is not unusual in high scandals. Women like Lejeune often find themselves bearing the brunt of moral judgment, while the men involved often walk away unscathed, shielded by wealth and connections. In Huo Jincheng's case, his image as the golden boy CEO remained intact, while Lejeune's reputation lay in tatters. Society's double standards were there in every comment that demanded to know why she stayed, why she hid, and why she didn't walk away. The harshest critics seemed to assume her silence was complicity, rather than asking why Qiu Qianchang allowed her to remain invisible. It's the kind of selective outrage that lets powerful men remain their positions, while the women swept along in their wake are discarded without consideration. Lei Han was not just fighting against the Hu family. She was contending with a system that seemed designed to crush her. The breaking point came on an evening that began much like any other. She had gone to see Hu Qincheng one final time, desperate to hear something, anything, that might explain how he could abandon her so easily. The mansion doors stayed shut, and the security team stood firm. She could see the soft glow of lights from the rooms where they used to laugh together. She could hear the muted sounds of guests mingling, likely wealthy families with daughters poised to replace her in his life. The rain began slowly, in sparse droplets that gave way to a torrent. Standing there in the downpour, Lei Han's clothes clinging to her skin, she realized no one was coming. Not Huo Jincheng, not his family, not even his staff. She wasn't just left outside the Huo family's imposing gates. She was locked out of his entire life. And yet, as broken as she felt in that moment, something shifted. There's a type of clarity that only comes when everything you've leaned on is stripped away. For the first time in 3 years, Lei Han no longer had anything to protect, no relationship to keep hidden, no fragile hope to nurture. If her sacrifices, her loyalty, and her love could all mean nothing to the man she thought she knew, then what was left for her to lose? She took a step away from the gates, then another. By the time she reached the street, her legs were steady, her spine straightened, and her jaw set. The rain masking her teary face felt oddly fitting. She was alone in every visible way, but internally, she was beginning to reclaim herself. This wasn't the end of her story. If anything, it was the beginning of something entirely new. What the Hyo family had taken from her, her pride, her worth, she would take back herself. They had left her out in the rain, certain they'd erased her forever. But what they didn't anticipate was the storm she'd become. Soon, the world would no longer see Lei Han as a discarded footnote in Hu Jincheng's pristine story. She would make sure of that. And so, as she walked away from that chapter, she stepped into a new one, not yet defined, but waiting. Her journey of transformation wasn't born from spite or vengeance. It was fueled by something more powerful, the need to rediscover who she was when no one else was watching. What happens when the girl everyone underestimated returns with a new identity? Lei Han's comeback wasn't just unexpected. It was the kind of transformation that left people wondering how they ever failed to notice her strength. It had only been months since she disappeared from public view, her name dragged through cruel headlines and whispers about her shameful connection. Now, she re-entered the same world that had cast her out, but under a new name, the fourth daughter of the Li family. Her connection to the Lis had always been a quiet footnote. Years ago, her mother, who married into a modest household, had been estranged from the powerful family for reasons no one discussed openly. Growing up, Lei Han never valued the ties to a family she was told wanted nothing to do with her. That is, until her life crumbled and she had no choice but to knock on their gates, humbled and desperate, not for their wealth, but for the security of knowing there was still somewhere in the world she could turn to. If they had turned her away, it would have been another rejection to add to the pile. Yet nothing prepared her for the coldness she faced during her first meeting with the Lee patriarch. "You think playing victim will earn you a place here?" Her eldest uncle's words had cut through the room like a blade. His gaze had swept over her with obvious disapproval, as if her very presence was an embarrassment to their name. The Lee family, after all, had built their reputation on being untouchable. His doubts were echoed by the rest of the family. Her attempts to explain what had happened with the Kwa family fell on ears unmoved by empathy. To them, she wasn't just an outsider. She was damaged goods. But everything changed when those closest to the heart of the family, the patriarch, her grandfather, and her eldest brother Jin Lee, heard her story in full. Lei Han hadn't intended for them to hear the details of her years as Hyojin Chang's secret lover. She had tried to keep the specifics private, protecting whatever dignity. But as rumors began to surface, linking her name to the Lees, pressure grew from the outside world, forcing her to tell the truth to the only people who could protect her. For once, the pain in her voice wasn't ignored. It was her grandfather's reaction that shocked everyone in the room. A man known for his stoicism and sharp business mind, Li Chen's immediate outrage broke that hardened facade. Slamming his cane down on the polished marble floor, he declared, "How dare they mistreat my precious granddaughter Lei Han?" For him, it wasn't just about the past. It was about how carelessly the Huo family had underestimated his bloodline. Those words were more than just a declaration of familial loyalty. They were a statement of intent. Li Qian didn't stop there. Turning to Jin, he added, "If the Hu family thinks they can callously erase her, we'll make them pay tenfold for 3 years of suffering they caused our girl." To a family as influential as the Lees, such sums were never metaphorical. They were promises. Lei Han sat frozen, struggling to process the shift in tone. For the first time since the start of her ordeal, someone in power had looked at her, not as a scandal to be forgotten, but as a member of their own. And it wasn't just her grandfather. Jin, her usually intimidating and distant eldest brother, was the next to speak. "No one disrespects a Li," he said firmly, meeting her gaze for the very first time. It even them. From that moment onward, Lei Han wasn't alone. It wasn't just empty words of support. The Li family operated with the kind of power and precision that only dynasties as old and wealthy as theirs could wield. While Lei Han had once learned what it felt like to be silenced, shamed, and discarded, now she saw the other side of power, its ability to rewrite the narrative completely. Phone calls were made, lawyers retained, and PR agencies brought in to reframe her image. Of course, none of this happened without resistance. There were Li family members who still disapproved, fearing what affiliating with someone linked to a public scandal might mean for their name. Old whispers among extended relatives continued to linger, but those who mattered, the core of the family, made their position clear. Lei Han was one of them, and they would protect their own. Lei Han's integration into the family was gradual, marked by moments that felt alien at first. Weekly family dinners, where no one measured their words for fear of public backlash, were surreal compared to what she had known in her years with Huo Qingqiang. Invitations to high society events, with her brothers leading her into crowded rooms, turned the same spaces that once judged her into arenas where no one dared to breathe a word against her. One of the biggest shifts occurred during a press interview her grandfather casually arranged at their estate. The purpose, he said, was simple: to remind the media of who she was. That gentle term carried far more weight than it let on. By the end of the article's publication, readers weren't discussing her past. They were marveling at her poise and grace as the Li family's long-lost gem. In analyzing cases like this, one thing becomes clear. In elite circles, power doesn't just grant privilege, it grants control over perception. As industry studies show, a single article can reset years of public judgment when the driving narrative comes from people with enough wealth and influence behind it. But while family alliances helped clear the debris surrounding her name, so She allowed herself to stand in the spotlight of the family's next big event, the night of the gala. A glittering soiree attended by some of the most influential business moguls and cultural elites. The air inside the Lashley estate was humming with chatter. Few had actually met Lehan yet, but her name had already become the subject of curiosity. The invitation had ensured it. Sent out in embossed gold print, it read, "The Lee family cordially invites you to the official debut of their fourth daughter." Lehan's nerves had almost gotten the best of her earlier that day. As stunning as the silk evening gown, custom designed for her, looked on the outside, for hours she debated whether she even had the right to wear it. After all she'd been through, had she earned the belief that had been placed back in her? Her grandfather's words before the event repeated in her mind. They weren't grandiose, nor were they particularly poetic, but they were enough. They underestimated who you are. Don't make the same mistake. When she stepped out of the grand staircase that night, the room stilled with stunned silence. It wasn't just her beauty, though she was radiant. It was the power of her presence, an elegance formed not in privilege, but in surviving humiliation and returning stronger. For some in the crowd, she was already unrecognizable compared to who they had heard she was. For others, her transformation was the center of gossip. The question on their lips wasn't only, "Who is she?" but "How did we ever doubt her power?" The evening unfolded with deliberate intent. The announcement of her new title wasn't made casually. It was declared by her grandfather in front of every guest. He raised his glass high, forcing every attendee to do the same. "To my fourth granddaughter, Lehan Lee, whose strength makes her deserving of this family and the name it carries." Standing there, surrounded by applause, Lehan wasn't naive enough to believe the night had erased every challenge ahead. She wasn't blind to how fragile loyalty in this world could be. But in that moment, she allowed herself to let the weight of what she had endured melt just slightly. She joined the toast and smiled, not because the doubts had vanished, but because it was the first time in months she felt like she could move forward entirely on her terms. The gala wasn't just an event. It was the turning point that confirmed her re-entry into a world she'd once believed was closed off forever, and it was only the beginning of what she planned to do with it. The grandeur of the Lee family gala began long before anyone stepped through its gilded entrance. The sprawling estate, shimmering under a canopy of perfectly placed lights, seemed designed to whisper, "There are no limits here." Rows of luxury cars arrived in precise intervals, each spilling out guests whose very presence represented wealth, influence, and connections. It wasn't just a party. It was a showcase of power. The rumors surrounding this event had only added to the sense of anticipation. Invitations had mentioned the introduction of the Lee's fourth daughter, a name barely known, her identity shrouded in mystery. Who was she? Where had she been? And why now? Inside, the air was thicker with intrigue than with the scent of imported roses. Chatter rippled through the ballroom like murmured questions waiting for answers. The Lee family had spared no expense. The marble floors gleamed as waiters in tailored uniforms navigated the room with trays of champagne glasses. A string quartet played softly in the corner, an understated but deliberate reminder that the Lees didn't need to rely on excess to command attention. Above the expansive room, crystal chandeliers threw prisms of light against towering walls, and the decor, though opulent, stayed elegantly restrained, a nod to tradition without drowning in extravagance. For many of the attendees, the conversation followed a predictable rhythm: polite greetings, veiled arrogance, and of course speculation. The whispers always seemed to circle back to the same topic: the enigmatic fourth Miss Lee. "Have you seen her yet? I heard she's been abroad all these years. But why such secrecy?" The questions were endless, and few had answers. Even the family members had remained tight-lipped, letting curiosity simmer until the right moment. One of the guests, Ojin Chang, entered the room without ceremony, his presence commanding attention the way it always did. He wore a sharp suit, perfectly tailored to emphasize his imposing figure, but there was an edge to his usual confidence that night. To most, he appeared at ease, exchanging curt nods and handshakes with the people who eagerly approached him. but his eyes moved across the crowd, scanning faces with a purpose. He had heard the rumors too, but they barely piqued his interest. The Lees' inner family affairs were a world apart from his concerns. Or so he thought. The announcement came without warning. The soft clinking of a glass silenced the room, and all eyes turned to the top of the grand staircase. It was Jin Lee who spoke, his deep, assured voice cutting through the stillness. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight. It is with great pride that we welcome back a member of our family, our sister, and my grandfather's beloved granddaughter, Miss Lee." For a split second, there was confusion, a moment where the name meant nothing to most of the attendees. But then, as footsteps echoed softly on the staircase, all heads turned. At first, the figure descending was only a silhouette, cast against the glow of the chandeliers above. But as she stepped closer, gliding gracefully down the marble steps, gasps rippled through the room. Leanne. Some barely recognized her. Others couldn't believe what they were seeing. She wore an evening gown, as tailored and refined as the room around her, its midnight blue fabric flowing effortlessly with her every move. The subtle sparkle at the edges of the dress caught the light, giving her an almost celestial aura. But it wasn't the dress, the jewelry, or even the meticulous makeup that set her apart. It was her presence. She moved with a composure that dared anyone to think of the girl she had once been, hidden, degraded, forgotten. She wasn't simply standing among Beijing's elite that night. She belonged there. Jin Chung felt his grip tighten around the champagne glass in his hand, the moment settling over him like a revelation that came too late. He recognized her instantly, though it felt impossible. The Lehan he remembered was soft-spoken, hesitant in her movements, always lowering her gaze as though unsure of her place in the world. But this woman, this polished, composed, and untouchable figure, was entirely unfamiliar. And yet, it was her. For a moment, the noise around him seemed to fade. The polite applause, the comments from those standing nearby, it all blurred into meaningless sound. His eyes followed her as she reached the final step, offering a small, calm smile to her family before turning to face the room. He waited for any sign of hesitation, a falter in her expression, something to suggest that this transformation was merely an act. It never came. Leon, meanwhile, could feel the weight of the collective gaze pressing down on her. Every time she stepped into a room now, she knew questions lingered. Did they see her strength? Or did their minds rush to the story of who she used to be? The woman humiliated and discarded. She had reminded herself, again and again, that none of that mattered. This wasn't about proving anything to them. It was about reclaiming herself. Her grandfather stepped forward, taking her hand in his and raising it slightly, as if presenting her to the crowd. "Tonight," he said, his voice steady and proud, "we celebrate family. Miss Lehan Lee has returned to where she belongs, and we are honored to see her take her rightful place among us." His deliberate phrasing left no room for doubt. This wasn't just a personal reunion. It was a declaration, clear and public. The Lees stood behind her, untouchable in their support. Public events in families like hers were never just social gatherings. They were stages, carefully crafted to deliver unmistakable messages. As Lehan stood under the watchful eyes of some of Beijing's most influential figures, it was clear what the Lees intended to communicate. If anyone doubted her after what had happened with the Hua family, now was the time to rethink those sentiments. This wasn't just an announcement of her return. It was a signal that she was untouchable, backed by a family whose name alone could rewrite reputations. Research often underscores the importance of public appearances among powerful families. Events like these act as social battlegrounds, where reputations are fortified, rivalries are subdued, and alliances are quietly affirmed. The Lee family had long understood this, mastering the subtle art of influence. A gala of this scale wasn't just a celebration, it was strategy. Even her most vocal critics would think twice before challenging her again after witnessing this display. Yet not everyone in the room knew how, or even if, they should approach her now. While her family's firm positioning shielded her from open whispers, Lahan could see the echoes of speculation behind carefully controlled expressions. Most wouldn't dare to approach with anything less than courteous admiration, but she had no doubt that questions still lingered across the room. Hua Jinchang was fighting his own struggle to appear unaffected. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of a decision he couldn't undo. Watching her now, he wasn't sure what stunned him more, the transformation itself, or his realization of just how much he had taken her for granted. She wasn't just a woman he once hid away from his family. She wasn't a mistake or a weakness, as his mother had insisted those years ago. She was magnificent, and for the first time, he understood the depth of what he had lost. But there was no time to react, not in a way that would matter. She moved through the crowd effortlessly, every interaction carefully measured. If she noticed him, she didn't show it. The gala wasn't just about dazzling appearances and expensive displays of wealth. It was a pivotal moment. As Lahan crossed the room with quiet confidence, shaking hands and exchanging polite conversation, it became increasingly clear that this night was on her terms. Everyone who had once dismissed her, doubted her, or turned their backs on her was now witnessing her rise, not as an accessory to someone else's life, but as a force entirely. By the time the truth of her identity sank in, the Huo family's carefully orchestrated narrative had unraveled completely. Guests murmured among themselves, relaying the sudden realization that the same woman who had once been reduced to rumors and scandal was now bound to one of the strongest families in the nation. This was no minor reclamation of pride, it was an outright reclamation of power. Anyone with lingering doubts knew them to be futile. With the Li name now tied to hers, any attempt to demean or discredit her carried consequences far beyond personal insults. They'd be going to war with the Lis themselves. And though the gala ended with polite farewells and applause, for Lahan, it was less an ending than a starting point. Everyone knew where she stood now, including the Huo family. This wasn't the conclusion of her story. This was the calm before the storm she was about to create. The lies started with a single detail, a small accusation whispered behind closed doors that quickly spread like wildfire. At first, it didn't feel real to Lahan. The Hu family wasn't subtle in their disdain for her, but she hadn't expected them to go to such extreme lengths. It began quietly, with rumors that painted her as a greedy opportunist, someone who had preyed on Hu Qinqiang's kindness to climb into his life. But the whispers didn't stop there. By the time she realized the full scope of what was happening, the accusations had turned poisonous, and everything she had worked so hard to keep private was being distorted into a public spectacle. The claims were intricate, carefully designed to make her look as guilty as possible. It wasn't just public comments calling her a gold digger or claiming she was unworthy. No, the Huo family had gone further. They fabricated employment records from her former job, suggesting that she had been fired for unethical behavior. False testimonies from supposed colleagues surfaced, accusing her of using underhanded tactics to gain promotions. Every detail was perfectly curated to destroy the life she had built before the relationship. And then came the most devastating accusation, the staged affair. The video appeared out of nowhere. One moment, she was clinging to what little piece she had left, and the next, every corner of the internet carried a grainy, out-of-focus clip that seemed to show her in a compromising position with another man. It wasn't her, of course. The entire thing was part of the Huo family's deliberate plan to sever her connection to Huo Qinqiang forever. They wanted to discredit her in every possible way while covering their own tracks. Adulterous divorcee, the headlines screamed, stitching together lies about her past to fit the narrative they wanted the world to believe. The video, paired with false claims about her fertility, made her out to be a woman incapable of offering anything to a man like Huo Jinchang. Not loyalty, not a family, nothing. The betrayal wasn't just a blow to her reputation. It was personal, calculated, and designed to crush her completely. And worst of all, it was effective. Society was cruel to women who loved powerful men, but it was crueler still to those who didn't fit into the boxes those men's families had carved for them. People didn't just believe the lies, they ran with them. Neighbors who once smiled at her now avoided her in the street. People she had worked with before began distancing themselves, unsure if the rumors were true, but unwilling to risk their own reputations by staying aligned with someone so publicly condemned. Lehan felt the weight of the betrayal in ways that went beyond the whispers and the stares. There were moments when she couldn't leave her apartment, her breath caught in her chest, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Harsh words she saw online, thousands of strangers tearing apart her character, as though she were nothing more than a story to dissect, cut deeper than anything she could have imagined. And behind all of it was the cold silence of the man she had once trusted. Oh Jianqiang didn't speak up. He didn't defend her. Whether it was out of fear of his family or shame for what had happened, it didn't matter. His silence was its own kind of betrayal. For a time, it felt easier to let it consume her. How could one person fight against an entire system? The psychological toll of being caught in a web of lies was unrelenting. Every piece of fabricated evidence, every false accusation, chipped away at her. Studies show how devastating false allegations can be, not just in terms of public perception, but on a deeply personal level. When society judges based purely on appearances, the accused often lose more than their reputation. They lose their sense of self. In Lehan's case, the lies weren't just about tarnishing her image. They were meant to erase her entirely, to make her feel as though she had no way back. But Lehan wasn't as broken as the Huo family thought. Beneath the fear, anger began to grow, a quiet defiance that refused to be silenced. She couldn't let this be her ending. If there was no one else who would fight for her truth, then she would do it herself. Her first step was understanding just how deep the lies went. It wasn't enough to prove the video was staged. She had to unravel the entire narrative the Hu family had woven against her. It meant hunting down witnesses, combing through documents, and asking questions no one wanted to answer. It meant showing up at offices where the fabricated employment records had supposedly originated, and demanding those responsible admit to the truth. Each piece of evidence she uncovered felt like reclaiming part of her dignity. An old colleague confessed that they had been paid to lie about her, breaking down in tears while apologizing for the part they had played. Paper trails revealed discrepancies in the video's editing, proving beyond doubt that it had been doctored to look like her. The deeper she dug, the more tangled the web became. But Lehan refused to let herself be intimidated. Her methods weren't flashy, and she didn't have the resources the Huo family did. But she had one thing they couldn't control: the truth. Piece by painstaking piece, she built her case, a collection of irrefutable facts that countered the lies they had so carefully spread. Witness testimonies, phone recordings, email correspondence. It all came together into something she couldn't wait to reveal. The gala was the perfect setting. It wasn't just a family gathering or a celebration of her return. It was an opportunity to take back control of the story. Standing amidst the polished marble and gilded chandeliers, with the weight of her new identity anchoring her, she prepared to deliver the final blow that would expose everything. The confrontation wasn't explosive. It didn't need to be. Lehan didn't raise her voice or throw accusations. Instead, she presented her evidence with a quiet, unshakable confidence that caught everyone in the room off guard. It began with the smallest detail, a single email that disproved the fabricated employment records. Then came the testimony, a video recording of her former colleague admitting to the Huo family. As the pieces fell into place, the atmosphere in the room shifted. When she unveiled the evidence that proved the cheating video had been staged, an audible gasp rippled through the crowd. For months, that video had been held up as the ultimate proof of her guilt, a crush for every whispered insult and judgment. To see it dismantled so completely left no room for doubt. The Huo family, seated stiffly in one section of the room, could no longer hide their discomfort. Every carefully curated lie, every false accusation, now exposed under the glaring light of the truth. Adulterous divorcee. The words that had been used against her now carried a bitter irony, hanging in the air like a defeated weapon. The Huo family's silence was deafening, a stark contrast to the confident proclamations they had once made about her character. They had aimed to destroy her, believing she could never fight back. Yet here she stood, not just surviving their assault, but rising above it. For Leihan, this moment wasn't about humiliating them. It wasn't about revenge, either. It was about reclaiming the life they had tried to take from her. The lies that had nearly destroyed her no longer held any power. What mattered now was what she chose to do with the freedom she had earned. As the night continued, the whispers around her changed. Guests who had once doubted her now approached with tentative smiles and congratulations, eager to align themselves with the Li family's newest star. And though her path to justice wasn't complete, she knew that this was the turning point she had fought so hard to reach. The lies had finally been destroyed, leaving room for the truth to take its place. But the truth is never the end of a story. It's what comes after that decides everything. What happens when an entire family stands behind you? For Leihan, the answer became startlingly clear in a single move. The Li family, known for their quiet dominance over numerous industries, wasn't just a safety net, they were a force. From the moment they claimed her as one of their own, her adversaries began to see the sharp edges hidden behind the family's polished image. She wasn't alone anymore, and her last name now carried weight that even the most powerful couldn't ignore. The Hu family, however, underestimated this power. They believed that time would erase their betrayal, that the harm they inflicted on Leihan would fade quietly into the background. After all, they had successfully controlled public opinion before, turning Leihan's image into a symbol of. When they joined the fight, it wasn't to dissolve rumors or make empty gestures of solidarity. It was to make a statement, one that would ripple far beyond a single scandal. It began when Leihan's grandfather, Li Qiang, gathered the core members of the family. They stood in the family's private library, surrounded by decades of legacy reflected in every rare book and intricately carved piece of furniture. It was here that decisions shaping the future of entire industries were made. And on this day, it was Leihan's name that sparked their discussion. "This isn't just about her reputation," her grandfather said, looking directly at Jin, her eldest brother. His voice was calm, but his words carried weight, each syllable as sharp as a blade. "It's about the insult to this family. They think they can ignore who we are. They think we'll let her suffering go unanswered. They're wrong." Jin nodded, his jaw tightening. It wasn't just an agreement. It was an acknowledgement of the responsibility he shared as the next leader of the family. Leihan stood nearby, listening, but unwilling to interrupt. The confidence she had begun to rebuild in herself was growing, but she couldn't deny the impossible scale of the fight she now faced. Whatever lay ahead, she wasn't fighting on her own. The decision was deliberate and precise. "I've revoked the Hu Corporation's eligibility from attending the medical expo," Li Qiang later announced, his tone matter-of-fact, as though the action was proportional to the offense. It wasn't a random punishment. It was targeted and devastating. The expo in question wasn't just an industry event. It was an annual gathering of the medical sector's most innovative projects and ideas. To lose a place in that circle wasn't just humiliating. It meant lost contracts, stalled partnerships, and millions in revenue slipping through the cracks. The consequences were swift. Key executives at the U Corporation scrambled to recover the invitation, blindsided by the decision. They requested meetings, called every connection they had within the industry, and even hinted at public retaliation if the decision wasn't reversed. None of it worked. The doors to the expo remained firmly closed to them, and the silence from the Li family was deafening. With that single action, the Lis made it clear that they could and would throw their weight behind Leihan. The fallout wasn't just financial. Within elite circles, reputation is as crucial as the numbers on a balance sheet, sometimes even more so. Losing their place at the expo became a signal to others that the Hu family was no longer untouchable. They weren't the indomitable force they once pretended to be, and the knowledge that a single decision from Li Qiang could sweep them off such an important stage sent waves of unease across the business world. If the Lis could make this happen, what more were they capable of? This move wasn't only about power dynamics, though. It was personal. Years of false narratives and whispered slander had targeted Lei Han without consequence, and the expo removal marked the first moment where the Hu family truly felt repercussions. For Hua Qianqiang's parents, who had orchestrated much of Lei Han's downfall, the blow was particularly difficult to confront. They had spent decades cultivating an image of their family as to watch their corporation, the heart of their legacy, falter under such an attack was not only infuriating, it was terrifying. Examining situations like this through research reveals a fundamental truth about families like the Lis. Power isn't just about wealth or influence, it's about control. Studies highlight how influential families use their connections to reshape narratives, protect their own, and settle scores in ways the average person could never dream of. Decisions like excluding a corporation from an exclusive event may seem straightforward on the surface, but their implications run deep. These actions send signals to competitors, allies, and detractors alike, making it clear where loyalties lie and the risks of crossing certain boundaries. In Leon's case, the message was simple. Harming A. Li would come at a cost impossible to ignore. For the Hu family, the expo was only one thread in the unraveling fabric of their influence. They soon noticed a ripple effect. Partnerships began to dissolve. Companies that once courted their approval now kept them at arm's length. Hushed conversations hinted that investors were beginning to question the company's long-term stability. Even in their social lives, they found themselves increasingly isolated. The families they regularly entertained no longer smiled with the same warmth. Their conversations laced with caution. It was often unspoken, but the truth loomed in the space between each interaction. The Lis had made their stance known. Lei Han herself couldn't help but marvel at how quickly things shifted. The world that once united against her seemed to crumble under the weight of the Li family's support. It wasn't lost on her that this was the same society that had judged her so harshly months before. Now, as the ripple effects continued, she saw fragile alliances could be. Those who jeered her then now sought to align themselves with the power backing her name. Still, her rise wasn't without its challenges. There were accusations, whispered and unsubstantiated, that she was simply riding on the coattails of her family's influence. Others suggested that the Li family's actions were too harsh, that their level of intervention bordered on vindictive. But Lei Han had learned to stand steady in the face of such judgments. She knew why they fought for her. It wasn't about petty revenge. Her family's actions were about setting a precedent, ensuring that what happened to her wouldn't happen again. To her, or to anyone who carried their name. For Lei Han, the moment that truly underscored how dramatically things had changed came in a brief conversation with her elder brother Jin. They were walking through the family estate one evening, the weight of the day's work visible on his face. She hesitated before breaking the silence, finally asking what she had been wondering for weeks. "Did you all stand by me like this? After everything, I thought I was too much of a risk." He stopped walking, turning to her with a look that was both serious and resolute. "Your family," he said simply, as though that word explained everything. "And perhaps it did. They tried to erase you. That's not something we'll ever let happen." Those words stayed with her as the Huo family's downfall persisted. By the time the expo concluded without their presence, the impact was undeniable. Deals they were counting on slipped through their fingers, handed instead to competitors who now moved in to fill the vacuum of influence. Relationships that took years to build crumbled under the pressure of rumor and speculation. And through it all, Lei Han stood stronger. Her grandfather's moves weren't just acts of retaliation, they were acts of restoration. With his steady efforts and the family's unwavering support, she wasn't simply someone who had bounced back from a scandal. She was someone who had risen far above it, a symbol of what could happen when power was wielded responsibly, with measured care and unshakable resolve. By the time the dust settled, the Hu family's once predictable dominance no longer seemed certain. But for Leihan, it wasn't about their defeat. It was about pulling herself out of the rubble their lies had caused, and finding her footing in a world that no longer seemed so daunting. The Li family had cracked open a door she thought was shut forever, and now that she stood on the other side of it, she had no intention of stopping there. As the Hu family began to feel the depth of their losses, the world around Leihan started adjusting to her resilience. Public perception shifted, new opportunities emerged, and the once heavy weight of her past began to lift. But this wasn't the end of her journey. It was only the beginning. With the Hu family weakened, and her path forward even clearer, she realized one thing: she was no longer living under someone else's shadow. This time, she was the one casting it. What happens when an entire family stands behind you? For Leihan, the answer became startlingly clear in a single move. The Li family, known for their quiet dominance over numerous industries, wasn't just a safety net, they were a force. From the moment they claimed her as one of their own, her adversaries began to see the sharp edges hidden behind the family's polished image. She wasn't alone anymore, and her last name now carried weight that even the most powerful couldn't ignore. The Hu family, however, underestimated this power. They believed that time would erase their betrayal, that the harm they inflicted on Leihan would fade quietly into the background. After all, they had successfully controlled public opinion before, turning Leihan's image into a symbol of. When they joined the fight, it wasn't to dissolve rumors or make empty gestures of solidarity. It was to make a statement, one that would ripple far beyond a single scandal. It began when Leihan's grandfather, Li Qiang, gathered the core members of the family. They stood in the family's private library, surrounded by decades of legacy reflected in every rare book and intricately carved piece of furniture. It was here that decisions shaping the future of entire industries were made. And on this day, it was Leihan's name that sparked their discussion. "This isn't just about her reputation," her grandfather said, looking directly at Jin, her eldest brother. His voice was calm, but his words carried weight, each syllable as sharp as a blade. "It's about the insult to this family. They think they can ignore who we are. They think we'll let her suffering go unanswered. They're wrong." Jin nodded, his jaw tightening. It wasn't just an agreement. It was an acknowledgement of the responsibility he shared as the next leader of the family. Leihan stood nearby, listening, but unwilling to interrupt. The confidence she had begun to rebuild in herself was growing, but she couldn't deny the impossible scale of the fight she now faced. Whatever lay ahead, she wasn't fighting on her own. The decision was deliberate and precise. "I've revoked the Hu Corporation's eligibility from attending the medical expo," Li Qiang later announced, his tone matter-of-fact, as though the action was proportional to the offense. It wasn't a random punishment. It was targeted and devastating. The expo in question wasn't just an industry event. It was an annual gathering of the medical sector's most innovative projects and ideas. To lose a place in that circle wasn't just humiliating. It meant lost contracts, stalled partnerships, and millions in revenue slipping through the cracks. The consequences were swift. Key executives at the U Corporation scrambled to recover the invitation, blindsided by the decision. They requested meetings, called every connection they had within the industry, and even hinted at public retaliation if the decision wasn't reversed. None of it worked. The doors to the expo remained firmly closed to them, and the silence from the Li family was deafening. With that single action, the Lis made it clear that they could and would throw their weight behind Leihan. The fallout wasn't just financial. Within elite circles, reputation is as crucial as the numbers on a balance sheet, sometimes even more so. Losing their place at the expo became a signal to others that the Hu family was no longer untouchable. They weren't the indomitable force they once pretended to be. and the knowledge that a single decision from Li Qiang could sweep them off such an important stage sent waves of unease across the business world. If the Lis could make this happen, what more were they capable of? This move wasn't only about power dynamics, though. It was personal. Years of false narratives and whispered slander had targeted Lei Han without consequence, and the expo removal marked the first moment where the Hu family truly felt repercussions. For Hua Qianqiang's parents, who had orchestrated much of Lei Han's downfall, the blow was particularly difficult to confront. They had spent decades cultivating an image of their family as to watch their corporation, the heart of their legacy, falter under such an attack was not only infuriating, it was terrifying. Examining situations like this through research reveals a fundamental truth about families like the Lis. Power isn't just about wealth or influence, it's about control. Studies highlight how influential families use their connections to reshape narratives, protect their own, and settle scores in ways the average person could never dream of. Decisions like excluding a corporation from an exclusive event may seem straightforward on the surface, but their implications run deep. These actions send signals to competitors, allies, and detractors alike, making it clear where loyalties lie and the risks of crossing certain boundaries. In Leon's case, the message was simple. Harming A. Li would come at a cost impossible to ignore. For the Hu family, the expo was only one thread in the unraveling fabric of their influence. They soon noticed a ripple effect. Partnerships began to dissolve. Companies that once courted their approval now kept them at arm's length. Hushed conversations hinted that investors were beginning to question the company's long-term stability. Even in their social lives, they found themselves increasingly isolated. The families they regularly entertained no longer smiled with the same warmth. Their conversations laced with caution. It was often unspoken, but the truth loomed in the space between each interaction. The Lis had made their stance known. Lei Han herself couldn't help but marvel at how quickly things shifted. The world that once united against her seemed to crumble under the weight of the Li family's support. It wasn't lost on her that this was the same society that had judged her so harshly months before. Now, as the ripple effects continued, she saw fragile alliances could be. Those who jeered her then now sought to align themselves with the power backing her name. Still, her rise wasn't without its challenges. There were accusations, whispered and unsubstantiated, that she was simply riding on the coattails of her family's influence. Others suggested that the Li family's actions were too harsh, that their level of intervention bordered on vindictive. But Lei Han had learned to stand steady in the face of such judgments. She knew why they fought for her. It wasn't about petty revenge. Her family's actions were about setting a precedent, ensuring that what happened to her wouldn't happen again. To her, or to anyone who carried their name. For Lei Han, the moment that truly underscored how dramatically things had changed came in a brief conversation with her elder brother Jin. They were walking through the family estate one evening, the weight of the day's work visible on his face. She hesitated before breaking the silence, finally asking what she had been wondering for weeks. "Did you all stand by me like this? After everything, I thought I was too much of a risk." He stopped walking, turning to her with a look that was both serious and resolute. "Your family," he said simply, as though that word explained everything. "And perhaps it did. They tried to erase you. That's not something we'll ever let happen." Those words stayed with her as the Huo family's downfall persisted. By the time the expo concluded without their presence, the impact was undeniable. Deals they were counting on slipped through their fingers, handed instead to competitors who now moved in to fill the vacuum of influence. Relationships that took years to build crumbled under the pressure of rumor and speculation. And through it all, Lei Han stood stronger. Her grandfather's moves weren't just acts of retaliation, they were acts of restoration. With his steady efforts and the family's unwavering support, she wasn't simply someone who had bounced back from a scandal. She was someone who had risen far above it, a symbol of what could happen when power was wielded responsibly, with measured care and unshakable resolve. By the time the dust settled, the Hu family's once predictable dominance no longer seemed certain. But for Leihan, it wasn't about their defeat. It was about pulling herself out of the rubble their lies had caused, and finding her footing in a world that no longer seemed so daunting. The Li family had cracked open a door she thought was shut forever, and now that she stood on the other side of it, she had no intention of stopping. As the Hu family began to feel the depth of their losses, the world around Leihan started adjusting to her resilience. Public perception shifted, new opportunities emerged, and the once heavy weight of her past began to lift. But this wasn't the end of her journey. It was only the beginning. With the Hu family weakened, and her path forward even clearer, she realized one thing: she was no longer living under someone else's shadow. This time, she was the one casting it. Guo Jin-chen hadn't anticipated how quickly the weight of regret would settle over him. It started slowly at first, creeping in as whispers of Leihan's transformation reached him from unexpected corners. Barely a year ago, he had convinced himself it was for the best ending their relationship, letting his family's pressures dictate his choice. She had been their secret, kept hidden to avoid the complications her presence might bring to his carefully planned life. At the time, it had seemed logical, even necessary. He believed, or perhaps made himself believe, that it was the only solution. But standing in the grand ballroom of the Li family estate, seeing her command presence, with a confidence he had never known she possessed, the truth became inescapable. He had made an irreversible mistake. At the gala, everything about Leihan was different. She moved through the crowd with an ease that almost appeared effortless. Every glance in her direction was met with the faintest smile, a small, deliberate gesture of acknowledgement that neither invited nor dismissed. She wasn't seeking approval. That much was obvious. The woman who had once stood in the rain outside his gates, soaked and begging for an explanation, was nowhere to be found. In her place was someone unattainable, someone who didn't need him or anyone else to validate her place in the world. He couldn't help but watch as she exchanged words with foreign investors, executives, men and women who once wouldn't have given her a second look. And now, they looked to her with respect. It wasn't just her poise that unnerved him, it was her distance. In the past, there had always been a gravity between them, a silent understanding that tethered their worlds together, even in secret. But during the brief seconds when her eyes met his across the room that night, there was nothing. No flicker of recognition, no lingering warmth. It was as if he had been erased, reduced to just another face in a crowd she had long since left behind. For the first time, he felt truly inconsequential. That night marked the point when his silence became unbearable. For months after their separation, he had buried himself in work, attending endless board meetings, finalizing partnership deals, and throwing himself into new ventures as distractions. It wasn't until he saw her re-enter the public eye, as the Li family's fourth daughter no less, that everything he suppressed began clawing its way to the surface. And seeing her again at the gala solidified everything he had feared. She was no longer part of his story, but part of something far bigger, far more untouchable. Qian's first attempt to reconnect came shortly after the gala. It was quiet, subtle, a handwritten letter left on her desk at a business networking event they both attended, though at different times. He kept the message simple, thinking it best to ease his way back into her life. Leihan, I'd like to discuss what happened between us, if you're willing. I'm proud of all you've accomplished. Let me know if you'd be open to meeting. He signed it with his full name, thinking it might seem more sincere than impersonal. Days passed, then weeks. The response never came. The silence stung more than he wanted to admit. Still, it didn't stop him. A second letter followed, this time more personal, with an acknowledgement he had avoided before. I know I failed you. I regret the pain I caused more than you know. If I could undo it, believe me, I would. Please, just one chance to explain. He paused before sealing the envelope, hesitating, wondering if even those words could convey what he truly felt. No apology felt sufficient, but it was better than silence, or so he thought. Again, there was no reply. But what frustrated him more than the lack of acknowledgement was her complete indifference. Their paths crossed several more times, often in the same glittering circles of Beijing's elite. Each time, she greeted him as she would a professional acquaintance, polite, distant, as though there was no shared history, no love buried in 3 years. But beneath her calm, he saw what she was truly saying. She didn't care. Not about him, not about his regret, not about what could never be undone. To Huojin Chang, her indifference wasn't just rejection. It was a revelation of how deeply she had changed. This was not the same woman who once waited patiently for the hope that he might leave the shadows with her. This was someone who had found strength not in his approval, or even his forgiveness, but in herself. And that knowledge left him reeling. He began to see reminders of her everywhere. Not just in her carefully curated public appearances, but in the stories people told. Investors once aligned with his family now spoke highly of Li Han's strategic vision. Partners who had approached the Hu Corporation seeking opportunities now redirected their focus toward the Li family, drawn by her success in reshaping business narrative. Her deal with the global luxury brand, a partnership he knew had been fraught with complexities, became a case study in negotiation brilliance. It wasn't just her lineage or her connections that earned her acclaim. It was her ability to outthink and outperform expectations. Yet no matter how much he admired her growth, it only magnified a deeper truth. He had failed to recognize her worth when it mattered. Their relationship had been filled with fleeting moments of honesty, moments where she let her guard down and showed him glimpses of the unwavering resilience she now carried so openly. But was it? Or was it always there, waiting for the right moment to rise? That became the question that haunted him. Regret, studies show, tends to wield its sharpest edge when paired with reflection. Once someone realizes they've overlooked another's value, it doesn't just hurt, it creates an internal reckoning. Chuojin Cheng's realization was a painful, slow unraveling, forcing him to confront years of dismissal and inaction. How many times had he made her wait? How often had he asked her to believe in him without offering the same in return? The enormity of what he had lost pressed against him, stubborn and unrelenting. Unable to ignore it any longer, he attempted a final gesture and was attending a business panel as the keynote speaker. Her reputation as a rising figure solidified, not only in China, but beyond. He used his connections to ensure he could attend unnoticed, careful not to attract attention. Sitting in the back row, half hidden beneath the shadows of the dimly lit auditorium, he listened to her speak. Her words were measured, calm, reminding him of why he had admired her to begin with. "Resilience isn't a trait, it's a choice," she said, her voice steady as she scanned the audience. "It's deciding every single day to push forward despite the world's attempts to tell you who you are or who you'll never be." The room was silent, captivated, as the reality of her journey came through in every syllable. To him, that silence was deafening. Every word, though not directed at him, felt like an answer to questions he hadn't been brave enough to ask her when it mattered. As she exited the stage, surrounded by the buzz of photographers and admirers, he hesitated. His instinct pushed him to approach, to ask for yet another chance, one more moment. But something about the way she carried herself made him stop. She didn't stand in the crowd for familiar faces. She walked forward, fully immersed in what lay ahead. Without a word, it was clear. For Leihan, his regret was meaningless. Her journey had never needed his validation or his apology. What mattered was the person she had become, formed not by his abandonment, but by her ability to rise after it. There was no forgiveness to offer, because there was no debt to repay. Jianqiang left the event that day, knowing there was no going back. He had spent so long convincing himself that time would grant him another chance. A chance to explain, to fix, to undo what had been broken. But watching her now, he realized that he had been chasing something that no longer existed. The Leihan of the past, the one who waited for his love, didn't need him anymore. She never would. He wasn't angry, nor was he bitter. What he felt was something much deeper, something quieter, but more enduring. It was the kind of loss that lingered, not in moments of pain, but in the slow realization of time. Leighton's journey wasn't about exacting vengeance or proving anyone wrong. It was about finding herself, and now, as she looked toward her future, her focus was wholly her own. The man who realized too late was simply a footnote in her story, not the author of it. And for the first time, Hua Qianqiang finally understood. He had always been far more replaceable than she could ever be. What happens when you face the person who once broke you? For Leihan, that question wasn't hypothetical anymore. When the message from Huo Jinchang arrived asking to meet her, she hesitated. Months ago, maybe even weeks, it would have been an easy decision. She would have ignored it, pushed the thought of him aside, and kept moving forward. But now, something in her needed to, not because she wanted to understand him, or even because she owed him a response, but because closing the door on her past felt incomplete without confronting the man who had set so much of it into motion. She chose a neutral setting, a quiet lounge at a boutique hotel away from the thick of Beijing's glittering social circles. It was a place where the noise of her family connections and his notoriety wouldn't intrude. Leihan arrived first, of course, early enough to steady herself, though she didn't need as much time as she once thought. By the time he walked in, his posture slightly more rigid than it used to be. She had already decided this meeting wasn't about him at all. It was for her. He stopped a few feet away from her table, hesitating like a man who had rehearsed this moment for hours and still wasn't ready. "Leon," he started, his voice quieter than she remembered. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me." She didn't say anything at first. Instead, she motioned for him to sit, leaning back in her chair with an air of calm that wasn't natural to her before. That alone unsettled him, though he tried not to show it. He took his seat, his hands folding on the table as if anchoring himself. "I won't take much of your time," he began, breaking the silence. "But there are things I need to say. Things I needed to say a long time ago." Leihan met his eyes directly, neither softening nor averting her gaze. "You needed to say them, or you wanted to say them now that it's convenient?" she asked, her tone even, giving nothing away. Huo Jincheng faltered slightly, but pushed forward. "I admit my mistake," he said, the words coming out slowly, as though each syllable had been weighed beforehand. "I was wrong, not just in what I did, but in how I allowed my family to treat you, how I didn't defend you. Every part of it. I failed you." Her expression didn't shift, though something in his tone twisted faintly in her chest. It wasn't because she believed him entirely. It was the sheer audacity of him owning it now. Years too late to matter. 3 years, she said at last, quietly but firmly. "For 3 years I stayed. I stayed through every excuse, every hidden dinner, every goodbye made in the shadows, and I told myself, just wait. Just explain if he just trusted me even once. This will..." She tilted her head slightly, her stillness disarming. "Do you know what that does to a person?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked down at his hands, as if the guilt he carried could be solved by avoiding her gaze. But she wasn't finished. "When your family called me a mistake, when they staged that video, when people I didn't even know called me disgusting names, do you know what kept me going?" she asked him. "It was the hope that maybe you'd finally say something, that after I gave everything I had, you'd say enough, that's not who she is. But you didn't." His jaw tightened, a faint tension in his expression giving away what he wouldn't say. The weight of her words hit somewhere they hadn't before, perhaps because he was finally forced to hear them. "You're right," he admitted, his voice low. "I let you take the fall for everything. I listened to what they said about you, and I chose not to fight it." She asked, the question sharp, cutting into him like a blade. Leihan leaned forward slightly, her calm composure still entirely intact, but a flicker of something sharper burned in her voice. "Why didn't you fight for me?" He didn't answer at first, and when he finally spoke, there was no attempt to justify himself. "I was weak," he said after a long pause. "I let them control me, control my decisions, because I was too afraid of what it would cost me. to go against them. And you paid for that. The honesty of it caught her attention, but not because it softened her. If anything, his words only hardened her resolve. Lehan studied him for a moment, the silence between them stretching longer than he could bear. Finally, she said, "Do you think saying it out loud changes anything? That admitting you failed makes up for what I went through?" Leon, quickly, shaking his head. "It doesn't. I know it doesn't." His voice cracked slightly as he leaned forward, his hands clenching together. "But you have to know how much I regret it, Leon. I regret all of it. Every time I let them tear you down. Every time I stayed silent." "Stop," she said, cutting him off. Her voice wasn't loud, but it commanded him to listen. "You regret it because you've seen what I've become, not because of what you lost back then. Don't sit here and tell me this is about anything other than trying to ease your conscience." His silence said everything. For a moment, he stared at her, the weight of her words settling over him like a sentence. She didn't flinch, didn't look away. Her voice softened then, though not with warmth, only with clarity. "You didn't break me, Jin Chang," she told him, using his name in full, an intimacy that felt oddly impersonal now. "I gave you 3 years of my life, thinking you were strong enough for us. You weren't." "Leon, I know I can't undo what happened," he said, desperation creeping into his voice. "But I'm asking for a chance, one chance to start again. I've learned, I've changed," she said simply. The word hung in the air, final and immovable. Her eyes never wavered from his, even as a flicker of emotion passed through his expression. Desperation faded into something quieter, something closer to resignation. "I'm not the same woman you knew," she continued after a pause. "I'm not here to undo the past or fix what you broke. I'm here to make sure I'm not carrying it any longer. I don't need closure from you, Jin Chang. I already made peace with what happened." He looked like he wanted to say more. His lips parted slightly, as if searching for the right words, but she didn't wait. Lehan rose from her seat, her movements smooth and deliberate. As she reached for her bag, she glanced at him one last time. "This isn't about forgiveness," she told him. "It's about moving on. And that's exactly what I'm doing." Without waiting for his response, she turned and walked away. Her heels clicked softly against the polished floor, a sound that faded as she disappeared from his view. She didn't look back, not even once. Wo Jin Chang sat there motionless, his gaze locked on the empty chair across from him. For a man accustomed to power, to negotiation and control, the realization of his own insignificance was a bitter one. She was gone now, truly gone. And for the first time, he fully understood what that meant. Lehan didn't feel triumph as she exited. What she felt was far more valuable: freedom. The chapter wasn't erased, but it was finally closed, and for the first time in years, her story was hers to tell, unburdened by the weight of everything he hadn't done. The man she left behind wasn't the villain of her story, just a consequence of choices she no longer carried. And as she stepped out into the crisp evening air, she knew without question that her past would never have the power to define her future again. Lehan stood at the top of the Lee family's headquarters, staring out at the city skyline stretching endlessly before her. This view had once seemed so distant, so unattainable, like a horizon she could never reach. But now it was hers, not because it had been given to her, but because she had earned it. The woman who started as a forgotten name whispered behind closed doors was now a name spoken with pride and admiration. How does it feel to rise above everything that was meant to destroy you? For Lehan, it felt as though she had finally reclaimed something no one could take from her again: herself. Her journey wasn't linear, nor was it easy. The lowest point came in the rain, standing outside the Huo family gates, stripped of the love she thought she had and the dignity she had worked so hard to hold on to. In that moment, everything seemed lost. Her relationship, her reputation, even her sense of identity. She could have let it all define her. For weeks after that night, she was tempted to. The whisperers, the headlines, and the judgment were relentless. urging her to shrink, to disappear. But instead, she made a decision she hadn't been ready to admit to herself at the time. She chose to endure. The challenges weren't just personal, they were systemic. Lahan found herself fighting against more than just societal judgment. She was up against years of ingrained bias that dictated who deserved power and who didn't. She knew what people said behind her back when she first stepped into the Lee family's business empire. They talked about her as a charity case, someone undeserving of her position. Those whispers cemented her resolve, rather than breaking it. She threw herself into every project, every analysis, approaching her work with a precision that surprised even those who expected her to falter. Her first major success emerged during the negotiation with the global luxury brand, a moment that became the turning point of her career. That deal wasn't meant to go to her. Executives within her own company had openly questioned whether she was capable of navigating the complexities of a high-stakes partnership. Some doubted her because of her newness to the corporate world. Others dismissed her outright because of the lingering shadow of her public scandal. And yet, the terms she secured not only exceeded expectations, they redefined what the Lee family's business ventures were capable of. Her ability to analyze risks and meet challenges head-on ensured that the once struggling luxury malls revitalized their image under her watch, becoming centers of innovation and profitability. When the partnership became public knowledge, her name surged through industry discussions like a wave disrupting the calm. Partners praised her sharp acumen, and investors followed soon after. That moment cemented something essential. Lahan wasn't simply benefiting from the Lee name. She was building its future. But businesses don't just run on strategy. They run on people. Respect was never given to Lahan freely. It was earned in subtle ways, through consistency and tireless determination. Whether in late-night meetings or 5 a.m. calls with overseas contacts, she remained steady, focused, always prepared. Her colleagues began noticing the way she approached problems, calmly yet unrelentingly. Decisions that once met skepticism soon became decisions. Success came not from any single victory, but from the foundation of reliability she built over time. What Lahan didn't expect was how her achievements in business sparked an entirely new level of respect in the social sphere. The same people who had avoided her at events now leaned in closer during conversations, listening, waiting for her next move. The power dynamic had shifted, but not because she demanded loyalty. It shifted because she no longer needed it. Her victories, both personal and professional, spoke for her in ways even her fiercest defenders couldn't respect. Didn't mean the challenges simply disappeared. Lahan often felt the weight of her past follow her, though over time, its voice grew quieter. Early in her transformation, she feared she'd never outrun the articles, the assumptions, or the faint glances from across rooms. But she learned another truth that surprised her. Resilience wasn't about silencing those voices. It was about carrying on, even when they surrounded her. Research backs the significance of this kind of transformation. Studies show that self-belief and resilience often play critical roles in overcoming adversity. And Lahan's ability to rise above societal judgment became a case study in itself. Her journey was never about erasing what she endured. It was about ensuring that it no longer controlled her narrative. According to her own words, shared during a business summit, resilience isn't a trait, it's a choice. It's deciding, every single day, to push forward, despite the world's attempts to tell you who you are, or who you'll never be. Success gave her peace, but that peace didn't come from power or prestige. It came from knowing that she didn't have to prove her worth to anyone anymore. Least of all the people who had doubted her. She no longer measured herself against their scale, their expectations. As her influence grew, so too did her understanding of her own value. That realization was life-changing, not just for her, but for every person who watched her rise. Even Qiujin Cheng was forced to confront what her transformation meant. His regret stood as its own form of recognition, though it neither validated her nor swayed her. Lahan's final confrontation with him left no room for ambiguity. She walked into that meeting not to forgive him, but to free herself from the weight of his choices. Her decision not to reconcile was simple. Her life wasn't tied to his story anymore. It never truly had been. Closure came not from his apology, but from her ability to walk away without hesitation. Len's story demonstrates the enduring power of self-worth, showing that triumph isn't defined by seeking approval or fitting into someone else's narrative. Her success was about more than reclaiming her dignity. It was about redefining what she could achieve, not in reaction to others, but for herself. What began as a journey to survive betrayal evolved into a journey of self-discovery and influence. In overcoming manipulation, false accusations, and heartbreak, she proved that strength doesn't always start loud and obvious. Sometimes it builds quietly, unnoticed, until it becomes unshakable. As her name became synonymous with growth and resilience, Leigh-Anne made a deliberate choice about where she stood in the world. She didn't let herself be boxed into the label of the Lee families. From the way executives sought her insights to the way reporters framed their stories about her, the message was clear. Her power came from within. The influence she built reached far beyond her family's business empire. Young women watched her rise with awe, many of them inspired by the clarity of her decisions. Leigh-Anne became a quiet yet impactful advocate for redefining resilience, not through grand speeches or interviews, but through her actions. She didn't lecture on what empowerment looked like. She showed it. Her success proved there's no single path to overcoming adversity, no perfect timeline for recovery. What mattered was taking ownership of one's narrative and refusing to let anyone else write the ending. By the time her story reached its peak, it wasn't just about her anymore. Leigh-Anne's experiences echoed into the lives of others, a reminder that societal judgment can't define worth, and that true strength often comes in moments when everything else feels broken. Her triumph wasn't just personal. It was collective. Every person who saw her rise, who understood what she had endured, carried away a piece of the lessons. The power of Leigh-Anne's story rested not in its twists or even its victories, but in its humanity. It wasn't about being perfect or invincible. It was about perseverance. And as the world looked on, watching her climb higher than anyone, not even herself, might have imagined, the lesson became clear. Adversity doesn't define who you are. How you rise does. As the night descended over the city she had once walked through unnoticed, distant and uncertain of her place, Leigh-Anne stood quietly on the edge of the rooftop terrace. The skyline shimmered in reflection of her triumph, not brighter than it had ever been, but brighter than she had ever seen it. And this time, she didn't hesitate to reach for its horizon, because this time, it belonged to her. So, what about your own struggle? Think about the moments where your resilience has been tested. What would you do differently if you, like Leigh-Anne, had nothing left to lose?